Chapter 2. "He's down," Brett called in. He waited and watched the body for a few moments, and then advanced slowly toward it. Within a few minutes, Chinook helicopters appeared over the trees surrounding the cabin and descended into the wide yard. Out of them poured the Homeland Security agents, holding their modified MP5s at the ready. They swarmed over the place, securing the perimeter and examining every meter of it. Once they had given Brett the all-clear, he shouldered his rifle and walked towards the cabin. The detectives had picked up the corpse and placed it in a heavy black bag. Brett stood on the small step where the dead man had stood only minutes before. Small particles of blood and skull littered the porch, but one of the agents had commenced sweeping these into a small Ziploc bag. The door of the cabin still hung open and was swaying in the breeze, the aged hinges quietly creaking. The agents began to enter the house, and Brett followed. Before his marksmanship skills had led him to becoming a sharpshooter, he had been one of them, and so he went with them almost automatically. It was dark inside the cabin and smelled strongly of cigarettes. Everywhere was clutter and jumbles of magazines, and a muted, small, flat-screen television set on the dining room table was playing C-SPAN. A disassembled AK-74 was lying in front of the TV, with some cleaning equipment and ammunition nearby. From the portable radio somewhere in the heap on the table came the voice of Hector Nightingale, host of the conspiracy program Thuban AM, who was presently speaking to a caller. Brett caught only snatches of the conversation. The caller was saying something about the Knights Templar and runic prophecies, and Nightingale was listening and prompting him to continue at intervals. He was making some link between these things and something or other to do with NASA. This was the usual sort of thing that was discussed on the program. As they moved into the front room of the house, they saw that it too was filled with reading material. Pages torn from books and taped to the walls, magazine clippings and newspaper articles scattered everywhere. The blinds were closed, and the only light in the room came from the monitor of a laptop stuffed in a pile of papers and books. As they sifted through the books, they found titles as varied as anthologies of Poe and Bierce, to Albert J. Nock's Our Enemy the State, to Guevara's and Mao's writings on insurgencies, to an autographed copy of Hector Nightingale's book, A Fortean History of the United States. Open on the desk was a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, with certain passages underlined seemingly at random. Finally, they came across an English edition of Spengler's The Decline of the West, in which was a copy of some plans for making primitive but powerful explosives. As the agents opened the book and the plans fell out, Brett noticed that, again, a passage had been marked. Since he could not pass the other detectives who were taking the bomb plans, he read over the highlighted passage. "By the term Caesarism, I mean that kind of government which, irrespective of any constitutional formulation that it may have, is in its inward self a return to thorough formlessness. It does not matter that Augustus in Rome and Huang Ti in China, Amasis in Egypt, and Alp Arslan in Baghdad disguised their position under antique forms. The spirit of these forms was dead, and so all institutions, however carefully maintained, were thenceforth destitute of all meaning and weight. Real importance centered in the wholly personal power exercised by the Caesar, or by anybody else capable of exercising it in his place. It is the recidive of a form-fulfilled world into primitivism, into the cosmic historyless. Biological stretches of time once more take the place vacated by historical periods." Agent Brett followed the general sense of this, though his pragmatic analyst mind had little use for the esoteric and mystical aspects of that now obscure German's text. More hours were spent in searching the shack, which indeed proved to be filled with stockpiles of all kinds of illegal explosives and outlawed firearms. But the biggest treasure trove of all was the hard drive of the recently deceased computer. This contained addresses, names, and aliases of many of his colleagues scattered throughout the state and across the country, and some that seemed to be even more widely dispersed. They found the dead man's journal in his jacket pocket. This small, well-thumbed notebook contained a more detailed reference to the plot he had alluded to in a coded and encrypted communication to one of the other extremists, which he had sent a week earlier, the communication that had triggered alarms at the NSA and prompted him to be moved from the watch list to the terminate list. The target had been part of an increasingly virulent strain of an extreme survivalist movement that had festered in the U.S. for some time. Even now, several more raids similar to this one were being conducted across the state in what was soon to be called the Holiday Raid. However, the only casualty that day was the one for which Agent Brett was responsible. After leaving the cabin, Brett caught up with Agent Maynard, and they returned to the post where their day had begun, and after a few hours of downtime were on a flight back to D.C. on a Learjet. The news reports all stated that the man, Glenn Gullahan was his name, had been killed in a shootout with police and federal agents. The list of materials that they reported being recovered from his house was shortened as well, but one item which every news report made sure to mention was Nightingale's book. Nightingale had come increasingly to be the target of much controversy over the last few years for his vitriolic criticism of U.S. federal government policy and personnel, in a turn that had taken the program away from its original roots as a venue for the eccentric and strange to voice their ideas on the unexplainable and unverifiable. So it was, to supporters of the government, no surprise to find that his writings had influenced a would-be domestic terrorist.